Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mike McGee. I'm the CEO of Chiefs for Change. For those of you who don't know, we're a coalition of now 38 chiefs of state education agencies and urban school superintendents who serve about 7.5 million students. Today's topic is certainly very important to my members and the work they're doing across the country to serve kids well. We're going to be talking today about the small topic of civics education and the health of American democracy. I know you all are interested and invested in that, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I thought I'd just offer a couple of reflections and then introduce this fantastic panel. I think there's near universal agreement that today's U.S. students lack an essential grounding in civics education, and that a working knowledge of civics education and what it means to be a citizen in the U.S. is essential to a functioning democracy. Where agreement starts to break down is around questions of how we got into this situation and especially what we should do about it. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about today. Really excited about that. As I've been reflecting on this and talking to our panelists, I've been thinking a lot about state policy and what it can do to improve and incentivize civics education across states. And whenever you're thinking about state policy as it relates to education, you're inevitably thinking about accountability. A couple of years ago, Andy Smarrick wrote a piece in U.S. News that I've thought about ever since, where he talked about what accountability systems incentivize. And he said, once we decide which indicators are going to define success and then set people off to find the swiftest and cheapest way to get those outcomes, we can begin to distort complex enterprises. Other outcomes become expendable, even if those outcomes are important. So I think that that is a perspective that's really worth grappling with. At the same time, it's quite clear that U.S. students have had a very poor showing on civics education for decades, certainly predating even the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act. So I don't think we can scapegoat accountability to explain the situation that we're in, but we certainly want to talk about how state policy can incentivize schools to provide better civics education to students and support schools and teachers effectively in that endeavor. Second thing I'll just point out, and then we'll get right to our panelists, is we're certainly seeing at Chiefs for Change a shift in the conversation about outcomes to outcomes around post-secondary success. And it strikes me that that's an important and potentially very positive shift in focus, and that civics education, making sure we're preparing all students to be productive and engaged citizens, is highly relevant to this conversation that's emerging around post-secondary success. So all of that is to say, I think today's topic is a critical and central one for all of our conversations about improving public education in America, and very, very happy to have the panelists that we have today to talk about these issues. We have three great panelists, as I mentioned. I'm going to have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their organizations, but I'll just name them at the outset. Natasha Trivers is the CEO of Democracy Prep. Scott Warren is the CEO of Generation Citizen, and Louise Dubé is the CEO of iCivics. So I can't imagine a group of panelists to talk about these issues. And why don't we just go on down the line and talk a little bit about our organizations and our work. Louise?
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and very pleased to be here. So I am the executive director of iCivics. iCivics is the largest civic provider in the country. We are known for games, so teaching students about how the rule of law and our system of government works through games. So if you go to iCivics.org, everything we have is free. We were founded by Sandra Day O'Connor, and we now serve, this year, I think we're going to get to 7 million students More than half of the country uses us one way or the other. We have middle school, high school, and elementary users in a very active group of educators, some of which are in the room. But what also, and I think the reason I'm here, is the other aspect of our work. We, about a couple years ago, realized that we were swimming upstream in the civics education movement. In other words, if state policy did not change, and if the country did not value civic education in the way it should, we were not going to be able to scale any further. We're not going to be able to create a healthy democracy, which I think is the fundamental goal of education. So, Rahm Emanuel actually gave me a great cue for this before, where he said that this issue of social cohesion should be the center focus for education going forward. And I 100% agree with him, and we can talk later about how to do that. So what we did, we created an organization called, not an organization, but a project of iCivics called Civics Now, CIVXNOW.org, another completely free set of resources. And the idea is to join forces with all of our colleagues in the civic education community, of which Generation Citizen and Democracy Prep are both a part of. We now have 115 organizations that are part of our group, and the idea is to run a campaign to change the level of prioritization of civics in this country, and to provide state legislators with the resources to make the changes that are necessary to get civics into our schools. I will end it there, and we'll pick it up later.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Natasha Trivers, CEO of Democracy Prep Public Schools. We are a network of 21 high-performing public charter schools across the country. Our biggest footprint is still in New York, but we are also in Camden, New Jersey, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, San Antonio, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada. Our students are 98% people of color. They are also, 85% of them qualify for free reduced lunch. Our mission is to educate responsible citizens, scholars for success in the college of their choice, and a life of active citizenship. So you can imagine a whole lot of our programming is geared towards that second part, that life of active citizenship. And I'm excited to talk about that with you in a little bit.
Great. So I'm Scott Warren. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Generation Citizen. Huge fan of Democracy Prep and iCivics. Louise and I sometimes refer to ourselves as the odd couple. I don't know if we've ever been on a debate states together, so hopefully we'll be able to go through some of our of a panel, I should say. So Generation Citizen is all about empowering and activating young people to be active and engaged citizens through something we call action civics. So it's an experiential form of project-based learning, essentially an experiential form of civics where young people learn civics by doing civics. We work in middle and high schools across the country. We have offices in New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, here in California, Oklahoma, and Texas. And our young people choose very local issues, public transit, teen jobs, police community relations. They figure out the root cause of those issues and then take some sort of real action. And so it's really putting into practice a lot of the democracy that we actually want to see in the world. It's a little bit of, I guess, of a newer form of civics education that we can get into, because I think that one of the remarks that I liked earlier that I hope we get into is I completely agree that across the country we see everybody agrees that we should have more civics education, but what that means and the purpose of civics education is something where I don't think that there's agreement on. And I think that that's something that we're grappling with a lot internally, just in terms of figuring out, well, how much is civics about understanding how government works, how much is civics about understanding the processes at hand, versus how much is it about creating a more equitable democracy, recognizing some of the inequalities that have been present throughout our country's history and are present in our democracy today, and to what extent should civics be about helping students to reconcile their place in the democracy that we live in today. So I think that that's one of the ideological challenges that sometimes the civics education field sees, and it gets a little bit to the, well, we can all agree, just like, as American as apple pie is, that we need more civics, but what does that mean, to what end, is something that we're grappling with, and I think is something where action civics as a field is trying to grapple with as well.
Great. Thank you. Natasha, I wanted to start with you. Could you talk a little bit more about how Democracy Prep has been designed to sort of navigate any tension between very, very high expectations around core subjects like math and ELA and the civics education and emphasis on civic engagement that you provide to your students? How do you strike that balance? What does that look like in practice at Democracy Prep across your 21 schools?
Yep, of course. So we target, when we're growing in regions and also deciding to move into new regions to offer great schools, we target areas that are historically underserved. So as you can imagine, our students are coming in sometimes not just one grade level behind, but multiple grade levels behind. And so literacy instruction, math instruction has to be prominent in the master schedule. We double up on ELA, we double up on math through our K through 8 program. But we also believe that time is love, as many of the married folks in the room can probably attest to. So time is love in your personal life. Time is also love when it comes to design of school. And so if we're saying a life of active citizenship is important to us, that's our mission, then we have to provide time in the school schedule for civics education. And so the place we've done that in the way that's like sort of most concrete and formalized is in our high school program. If you flip to the back of this flyer that's in your seats, we have a number of graduation requirements that our high school students have to complete in order to graduate from the school. So there are 10 civic skills that they have to hit, and they can hit that anywhere during their high school time. They also have to complete a seminar in American democracy course, which is essentially teaching about the 3 branches of government, the checks and balances, what Supreme Court cases have shown us over time about our democracy. They read a lot of political theory about what are the underpinnings of our American democracy. And then they also have to pass a citizenship test with an 83% or higher. That's because our mantra is 83 is the new 70, 83 is essentially a 3.0 in college, and so we push our kids to that 83 average in a lot of things. And they have to complete a Change the World senior capstone project in their senior year. It's a year-long project where they have to pick one problem that they want to attempt to solve, or at least propose a series of solutions for. So that could include, how to solve homelessness in New York City, how to tackle childhood obesity, how to create more civically engaged young people. And they have to do research, they have to write a 15-page paper, they have to present to a committee of scary people, including myself and some board members, and they have to complete a certain number of hours at an internship that's tied to their project. So in the high school level, that's where it's the most formalized. But we do get out the vote drives from kindergarten through 12th grade. We do advocacy day where our kids are testifying at the state legislature. We believe that you have to give kids choice and voice throughout the school continuum and sort of create a microcosm of our democratic systems in the schools. So kids just voted in San Antonio on their mascot. His name is now DJ Owl. So we do lots of different things like that throughout the continuum. It's just less formalized K through 8, and it's very formalized in the high school.
Louise, as you hear everything that Natasha's describing, are states, are you seeing states incentivize the kind of approach to civics education that Democracy Prep is taking? Are there ways that you are trying to advocate that states incentivize civic education?
Yeah. Just to start with the basics here, only 9 states have a full year of civics. While most states, or half the states, over half the states, give credit for service learning, none actually require it. And while we have assessment for graduation in about 17 states, those are mostly the immigration and naturalization test. So this looks nothing like what Natasha was talking about. What she's talking about is a very serious endeavor to actually lay out all the components of what it takes to be a prepared and engaged citizen, right? And education is it's not one thing or the other, right? If you listen to the entirety of this conference, I think we all understand, those who have been in education for many years, that if you push on one thing, as you said, you push on knowledge, you're going to have a drop on skills and dispositions. If you push on dispositions, you're going to have a drop on other things. You must do all of these things together. And the only thing, this is no different. Civic skills, civic knowledge, civic dispositions are no different than what you need for math and for literacy. All we're talking about here is to put those in the context of democracy and of civic life. And that is the kind of model that we are proponents of. So we at Civics Now prepared a state policy menu that has all of these items listed out. It's a free resource you can download. And we also have sort of exemplars of legislation that we would approve of or we would suggest. States like Illinois have been very at the forefront of passing that kind of legislation that has comprehensive investments in civic education. Their program of democracy schools is one of the components of that, as well as 1 year of high school civics. That was funded with a private-public partnership with the McCormick Foundation. Other states, like in Massachusetts, for example, we recently, in the past year, passed both a requirement for new state standards, requirement for new grade 8 civics course, and 2 civics projects. That was the result of active work in a coalition with Generation Citizen, in which we pressed the legislature to adopt what is now going to be a leading model in the country. And $1.5 million of public money was allocated to that process, and we are also raising private funds to supplement that. So that's another model. And lastly, in Florida, there is a model in which we have a grade 7 civics course with an end-of-course exam, and that was funded by public funds. So every state will take its own tact and starts at a different place. Many other states have done great things. Colorado, Arizona, Washington State, many other states have done important work in civics, but in general, we are starting pretty far back, and much work needs to be done.
Just to follow up, Louise, as we all know, people tend to do what they're incentivized to do. And as something like the Massachusetts effort unfolds, do you envision the quality of civics education, the depth of student knowledge being assessed at the state level? And do you advocate for assessments to be incorporated into state accountability systems in order to better incentivize schools and classrooms to engage in this work?
So in our state policy menu, there is an accessibility assessment platform. We believe, obviously, if you assess a discipline and you leave one out, so math, STEM, ELA, all assessed, social studies not so much. So if that happens, then you're going to get the results that there will be less time in the classroom and less time overall devoted to social studies, and that is documented by evidence which shows there's less time in elementary schools for social studies. So the result is pretty clear. In Massachusetts, in the law, there is the ability for the department to state that if they want to use the civics projects as part of the assessment formula, they must declare it by 2021. We believe that that will happen. We believe there will be a new MCAS for civics. Probably, we don't know what grade level, probably grade 8. To make a coherent policy. And we believe that will result in a very clarity of purpose on the part of the districts. What is less clear, and there is less agreement, is how to do this, how to do the assessment, right? Everybody understands how you might do an assessment of civic knowledge. Civic skills are also something that is relatively understandable. People are less clear about how to evaluate a civic project and its quality, particularly in a group setting. And so those are all things that need to be worked out, and the department is looking at that right now.
Yeah. Scott, I want to turn to you. You talked a bit in your opening remarks about the difference between a sort of working knowledge of how American government works and the skills that one might need to be an engaged citizen, obviously related but not the same. Can you talk a little bit about just what's at stake here in the work that you're doing with young people across the U.S., and how are you navigating the politics of that work, in particular in red states, where these questions around citizenship can be kind of especially politically charged?
Yeah, delicately. I think to the first point, and something that we think about and needs to be front and center is for a lot of the young people we work with, and I'm sure it's the same at Democracy Prep and with iCivics, young people have a negative connotation of democracy when they walk into the doors of their school for a whole host of, especially low income, especially young people of color, for a whole host of valid reasons that the system has told them for virtually their entire lives that they don't matter, that they are marginalized. And so I think one of the things that does have to happen is that everything that we're talking about as it pertains to civics does need to be relevant to their own lives. And so if you start teaching things that are just about the three branches of government, that are just about how a bill becomes a law, and not actually relevant to their lived experiences, which is something that folks are talking about a lot in the civics realm, is what does a lived civics mean? What does it mean to actually ensure that the knowledge to bear that young people have from their own communities is actually relevant and not sort of an ephemeral part of civics itself is brought to bear. Now, what does that actually mean? I think from a curricular or pedagogical lens, there's ways to do that. From a policy angle, I mean, we're a huge fan of the Civics Project approach that was passed in Massachusetts. As it pertains to red states, and we are active in places like Oklahoma and Texas, I mean, I think that there is a way to make this work, and you do have to marry some topics as well. But I mean, we do work in places like rural Oklahoma where I've gone, and even, you know, I've talked to administrators and principals there that, you know, I'll walk into their school and they'll embrace more conservative principles, but at the same time they still care about the local issue that this community was talking about, was the fact that there wasn't a street light by a local train crossing. That actually had led to some pedestrian deaths in the last few months. And so this was a way, I think that what actually brought folks together was this lack of feeling power and agency in their own communities. And so I think that there is a way to bring people together on that. From a policy perspective, it's tricky, and I think action civics has been labeled a little bit as a more leftist approach. Because folks see it as, oh, well, you're just engaging young people to become activists. What does that mean? And I would just say, I mean, I guess this goes to Louise's point a bit, that on the civic knowledge, skills, motivation, behavior front, I think that you have to make trade-offs, but I think it's a false choice to say that you have to prioritize some over the others sometimes. For example, a lot of folks are pushing the citizenship test. I know that at Democracy Prep, that's something that happens. That's fine and insufficient, and I think that we would all agree with that, right? So we all want students to graduate knowing what's in the citizenship test, of course, but just as we would say that an adequate chemistry education is not just memorizing the periodic table, you have to actually understand how the elements come together. Same goes for civics. And so I guess I would just push a little bit that there's a little bit of a false choice in terms of are you just educating them to be activists versus actually understanding how government works at the same time.
Natasha, how do you see student agency playing out in your schools, and why is that something that you value as a network leader?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to explain what we value and what we really try to push with our kids is choice and voice in its simplest terms, because we're trying to engender this with kindergartners in the same way and with the same fervor as we are with 12th graders. So I think what that looks like is advisory programming on Wednesdays and Fridays where students are watching current events. They are engaging with what's happening in the world. They're also engaging with what's happening in their local community and in the school. And so we really create a lot of platforms and spaces for kids to voice what they think about things and try to change things at the school level and at the local level, because that's really accessible. And it's giving them that general sense of democracy is really about choice and voice in its simplest terms. And so we have really strong student governments at each of our schools. We, believe in things like class presidents and those kinds of roles, even with first graders, because it does start to teach children to have pride in their communities, to feel like their voice matters, to feel like they can be the stewards of the classroom and speak for the classroom on certain issues. Those things are really important. I think we engender activism just in the sense that we do believe in teaching kids about social justice issues. We believe in teaching kids about history accurately and not erasing parts of history. And if that engenders some activism and that leads students to send principals emails saying like, this trimester exam schedule is so unfair, like we don't have time to do this or that, which I just got an email forwarded to me this morning from a principal with a sixth grade student talking about what the exam schedule looks like and how it's unfair and how he would propose changing it. Like that, those kinds of things are exactly what we want to see in terms of being active citizens. I think some of what Scott is speaking to, a colleague of mine, Robert Pondicio, would capture it this way. If you're, as a school, sanctioning protest and helping to organize protest, that's not a protest, that's a field trip. And I agree with Robert there. I don't agree with Robert on everything, but I do agree with Robert on that. Like, we are pushing students to be active members of their community, and that spans multiple, like that means our kids are situated all along the political spectrum. They are not a monolith just because they are 98% people of color. But what matters to us is using your voice to have an impact on your community, whether that's the school community, the community in Harlem, the Bronx, Camden, San Antonio, or whether that's on the national or global stage. And I agree with Luis that if you shortchange a history education, you are shortchanging civics, and you are sort of saying on the state level that that's okay, and history sort of needs to take a back seat to ELA or math, which I think is problematic.
Natasha, just a quick follow-up. Have you found that increasing student agency and student voice translates in any way to them taking a greater level of ownership over their own learning when it comes to things like ELA and math? So are there these sort of benefits to the overall school climate and culture and sense of the importance of academic achievement to students by engaging them in civics work the way that you do?
Absolutely, and I think there are studies that show that particularly when you're talking about the high achievement of African American, Latinx students, that a strong civics education and also a strong education in looking at history, cultural identity, systems of oppression over time, like a strong education in all three of those spheres is actually going to have a very positive impact on students feeling bought into being in school, students feeling bought into doing really well in their AP English class. And so it does have that ripple effect. And so at Democracy Prep, we're working really hard. We have a strong civics program, but we're working hard to layer into our history courses as much as possible a really rich history education to also study systems of oppression over time, grassroots organizing over time, different movements for social change over time, because we know that all of these things do have a very positive impact on kids just achieving throughout our continuum and certainly persisting through college at very high levels. We just had our first 6-year college graduation rate, and it is 58%. And that is the exact national average. And our kids, as I said, 85% of them qualify for free reduced lunch. So we're essentially toe-to-toe with the national average on college completion, even though most stats would say low-income Black and brown students should be completing college at a rate between like 9 and 13%, depending on who you're asking.
Louise, we've been kind of hinting a bit at where the fault lines exist in the civics education community around some of these questions. Could you provide some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me just go one level deeper. So we have our coalition is transpartisan, we call it. It includes people whose views are very conservative and people organizations whose views are very left leaning. So when I look at this kind of a fault line that Scott was talking about between action civics and civic knowledge, it hides a few different things. One of the fault lines has to do with rigor of content. And I know this is a big topic for this conference as well. So should kids read the Constitution, it's an original language, should they read primary sources? Can we get black and brown kids to that level? So there's sort of around literacy and rigor. In the action civics world, again, sort of, yes, we like projects, but we like them to be focused on the research part of this, not so much on the action part of this. So that's one of the fault lines. Another one, which will not surprise you given the context of our political discourse today, is around civil discourse and classroom discussions around controversial issues. So there are many, many principals, and some maybe in this room, who feel very uncomfortable with that. There are many sort of, obviously there are schools that have a diversity of views. Many of them don't. And those that don't, protecting minority rights in terms of freedom of speech is a very hot topic. So that's a second place where
Just to clarify, by minority rights, you mean any minority viewpoint that might be in any particular school community?
Right, exactly. And that applies on both sides of the aisle. So that's one issue. With respect to the action civics, I think one of the fault lines is the role of adults. The role of whether you as a teacher or an educator have undue influence over the views of your students and where that line is. So I leave that. I'm just here to cause controversy. So I'm just, and then the last one has to do with student voice. When I go into red states to talk about policy, this is where I get the most pushback. Strangely enough, about the idea that students would actually participate in school decisions, and that is a point of contention which, we leave that up to the community to decide, but clearly the argument that you just made about the value of this isn't quite clear in some places.
And are you finding that is the result of different cultural viewpoints on authority,
Yes.
for instance, and the value of authority?
I would imagine so, yes.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
Yeah. I think there's not. First off, I'll say that one of the challenges, I think, and it's interesting to have the three of us up here, I think Louise and I would agree. So Generation Citizen essentially promotes a class right now. It's a semester-long class, and Louise's games have been through a short amount of time as well. But what we actually would want is for schools to prioritize civics throughout their entire ethos. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I've actually come to recognize that as more important as we go along, that a civics class, this goes to your time question, it's not enough to do all of this stuff. And so I think that becomes important, is how do you structure an entire school day so that, in science class you're looking at the pH levels of water, in math class you're looking at different survey results, so it becomes contextualized around civics overall. So I think that's something important to say. I think on the fault lines, the other fault line that I'd actually elevate is that of history. And I think history is relevant for civics as well, just in the sense of what is the history that you're teaching our young people as it pertains to our democracy. So a more simplistic way of thinking about this that has come up a lot lately is the 1619 project that was elevated in the New York Times as this country's history starts with the transatlantic slave trade versus when the actual Declaration of Independence was signed. That is something, for example, in Chicago Public Schools, they're now teaching the 1619 curriculum. What does that mean in terms of the type of America that students are learning about? And I think that's a fault line. I will say with Action Civics, the thing that we believe is it's not about the students actually being successful in their projects. If they are, great, but it is about cultivating the knowledge, skills, and motivation that we feel that an experiential approach through a project actually promotes more than another way would. And so I think that the goals are similar. I do think with the fault lines, I don't know. I've been thinking more about, I think the civics field is almost a microcosm of some of the ideological challenges in this country. And I almost think that part of what needs to happen, I think the Civics Now Coalition does a really good job of bringing this transpartisanship perspective to the table. I don't know if every coalition needs to do the same thing, because I actually feel like it's relatively impossible for everyone to agree upon what an effective civics education looks like. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't go into red states and rural communities, but I actually think it's okay for different types of civics to exist, and it's sort of problematic if we actually say this is the only type of civics education that should exist without actually leaving it to certain communities to adopt what they want to adopt as well. And it makes Louise's life more difficult because she has to run a broader coalition. So I'll say that, and I think that there's space for that, but I also think that there is space for different perspectives and viewpoints too.
Natasha or Louise, final thoughts before we give our audience a chance to ask some questions?
Not me.
Okay.
I just would love to talk to any state legislator as thinking about, I think politicians know about this problem, right? They know. I was talking to one last night, and the rate of voting in their district was 5%. And yes, that would make it harder if you had 95% voting rates, but also make it safer. So there is a sense here that this really, really matters, and whether the representation part of democracy, whether you really are a representative when only 5% of people voting for you, that's a real issue for us. So I think there's a natural constituency there, and I would hope that people would take it up.
I'll just conclude by saying I think we would all agree that the stakes around civic education are enormously high, and the politics enormously complex. And we absolutely do need the help of everyone in this room, and certainly people who navigate the complex politics of states, to be thinking about how to overcome these challenges around the fault lines in opinion, and move this area of education forward. So. Would love to open it up for any questions and continue this conversation for another 20 minutes or so, if there are questions from the audience. Are we going to pass a microphone around or come up? I think
There's 2 mics there.
Okay, so I think the way we'll do this is if you have a question, you can just come on up to one of those 2 microphones, and we'll ask from the mics themselves. Right in the front.
Hey, Ashley Berner at Johns Hopkins.
Hi, Ashley.
Big fan of this whole topic. We know it's really important. Research shows it's really important to have open classroom climates where teachers are prepared to lead students in disagreement. There's a lot of phobia about this, obviously. Where do you see good things happening with that? I know Democracy Prep is wonderful with this, but those of us who are interested in promoting that part of the conversation, where can we send policymakers to help teachers prepare for this?
Louise and Scott, what have you seen in the field that you think would be particularly illuminating for policymakers?
I think we have to take them to classrooms. We do that on a regular basis, take anyone to a classroom. It is very different in different locations, and I think it only matters to politicians in their own contexts. And so we have to take them in places where teachers are prepared to do so. There's obviously you're familiar with the work of Diana Hess in controversial issues and the importance of this. To see it in action is really beautiful. And there are many, many great teachers out there. I will just add one thing, though. The reality of social studies and civics in particular is that over the course of decades, right, we have disinvested in this and only accelerated during the ed reform sort of accountability years. A large swath of infrastructure was lost during that time. Principals, administrators, and educators simply don't have either the background or the training to do this. And so what we are asking for is to rebuild the infrastructures within the schools in order to be able to allow to do that, and then protect teachers, for school administrators to protect their educators, to actually be able to hold those political discussions in the classroom.
Yeah, I echo all that. I mean, I think we promote this in our curriculum in terms of, I think we've sort of lost the ability to know how to disagree, for lack of a better way of saying it. It's not about losing the ability to compromise, it's about losing the ability to disagree. And I do think that there's pedagogical practices that teachers can adopt. I mean, if you see this done well, it is because educators know how to do it in the classroom. I think that the point that Louise made earlier is an important one, where I think a lot of folks are skeptical that educators are infusing introducing their own political beliefs into the classroom when this happens. I think that's a myth that needs to be busted, but it also will happen through greater investment in professional development. So, I mean, the two-part answer is yes, that there are pockets of this happening around the country, and so we need to elevate those examples, and we need to demonstrate to educators that they shouldn't be scared of that, which means that district leaders should support them in their efforts to do so as well. And the second is that we do need to invest in something that we're thinking about a lot organizationally, but more professional development. I mean, this done well, it's not about a curriculum, it's about pedagogical practices in the classroom. And so the more that we invest in that, it's not the curriculum doesn't matter, but I think that's actually the direction that the field needs to go in.
A question in the back?
Yeah, I'm Michael Musante from the Center for Education Reform. We're in our second year of a project with the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation called Why America, and it's taking middle school students from public charter schools, and the invitation was put out to the traditional system, but they said no, to the areas in Washington, D.C. that shockingly none of these children have ever visited, even though they are literally like 5 minutes from their homes where they're growing up. And this year's theme is the Constitution as the contract, and then taking them to places like the Library of Congress where they're seeing original documents, to the archives, to the White House Historical Association, and all of these, and even to the Pentagon, which some people said, oh my God, you can't take minority children to the Pentagon. What are you going to brainwash them into joining military? They loved it. The response by all of these children seeing these places for the first time and then understanding what these places represent has been completely a massive success, and we're already booked for this season, for this year. And so I just wanted to ask, do you see value in ensuring that children understand the very history of the towns and cities that they live in, and getting them out of the classroom and into these things so that they see living history and building upon that?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. We have our 8th graders go to DC for that reason, to make sure that they can see some of these landmarks and original documents in terms of our government. I think it's important, in Harlem for them also to see important iconic places and landmark documents at the Schomburg in Harlem too. So like, depending on which region we're in, we think DC is a really important trip. We think really learning about that city or state's history too, through field trip, and then obviously international trip is huge for our students as well. To really get to understand our context as compared to other countries, to understand poverty in different contexts internationally. All of those things are important. I would say it's really important in the DC example to also pair that with really studying inequity in their community, whether it's Southeast DC, wherever the students are coming from. So it's not just looking at the underpinnings of our government and these important locations in DC, but it's juxtaposing that with what are some problems in the community, especially for those who are financially poor, and how do you affect change from your seat as a 6th grader or an 11th grader or a future college grad. So I think juxtaposing those two things would be really important.
One thing to add, and I know there's a lot of elected officials here, and this sort of goes on that point, but we actually see almost a specific data point that students will become more engaged when they actually meet an elected official. So a lot of times our students just have no idea who these elected officials are, and so either meeting with them or there's a point in our curriculum where they actually make calls to offices, and it's almost this unique experience where they're not used to making calls anymore. But when there's actually someone on the other line that's listening to what they're saying, it's an incredibly powerful experience where they actually feel heard. So that, in addition to visiting and thinking about whether it's in DC or one's own community, the inequities that are there, just the act of meeting folks that are making decisions is something that I think is an important part of the civic experience too.
Question in the front?
Yes, Jim Runstead from Senator, Michigan, and I have a teaching degree. My father was a principal, my mother was a teacher, my sister was a teacher. I went through kind of a civics government class back in high school, and it took all of the time just to learn the foundations of our republic. And the idea that we would have the teachers imparting all these concepts, do I have a concern that they are going to proselytize Their view may be completely nothing to do with the founding of the nation or the background of the nation, but what their view is, I have a huge concern. In fact, I think that's precisely what would happen. What we're dealing with today is only a quarter of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. This is a recent survey. Nearly a third cannot name one branch of the government. In 2016, there was a survey found that a fourth of Americans and a third of the millennials feel that more people were killed under George Bush than Joseph Stalin, who killed about 20 million people. So the idea that we could have these students going all around and protesting here and there on local issues and not have the glue of the society or understand internationally totalitarianism, slaughter, murder of people because they're ignorant of all this stuff, there isn't the time to have them go do social justice warriors all over the place and still get the glue and the understanding of the foundations of this country. So my point, I would like a little more balance. It seems like everyone in the panel is from the same perspective. I think we need to get the young students today 100% understanding the foundations of this country, which I personally believe is the greatest country that's ever existed. And I don't think they're getting that. I think they're getting quite opposite, in many cases, messaging from the schools. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm so sorry that you got that impression. So we are advocating very seriously for a full year of civics at the high school level, at least a semester at the middle school of classroom instruction, direct civic knowledge about how this country works and why and what are the values and how are they embedded in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and so on and so forth. So there is no doubt that I totally agree with you that that is not happening today and that it needs to happen today. We're even supportive of the immigration naturalization test as is in democracy prep. We only think it should happen in middle school and a next step should occur beyond that. All I'm saying is that like a science class that would have a science lab, a civics education without some practical application that is relevant to you is going to come out in one ear and go out the other. And that's really what we're really forming civic participants and citizens of our country for the rest of their lives. And it needs to stick. That's essentially what we're trying to do. And to add to your very scary statistics are the statistics about the consumption of digital information. We recently had a study that showed that 52% of kids couldn't determine whether a video that showed ballot stuffing that was actually a video made in Russia was 52% of the kids thought that that was strong evidence of there being fraud in the 2016 election without having any concept of how you might check whether the video was valid or not. We are now a digital democracy. We need to educate students in a very explicit way about how digital information works and is sustainable. So we are entirely in agreement with you.
Natasha, I'm curious, how are you approaching with democracy prep students the need for this sort of foundation of knowledge about both U.S. history, but about things like, even in the simplest terms, the branches of government? Mm-hmm. How are you enforcing that that's important for your students, and how are you assessing it?
Yeah, I think in the seminar in American Democracy class, we still allow for a certain amount of autonomy on the part of the teacher to kind of take the course in the direction that they want to go. We think that's important from a teaching standpoint, but there are certain standards and just core elements about how the American government works that has to be present in that course. So just outlining it in clear standards has been helpful for us. One teacher, just for example, taught the course almost predominantly through Supreme Court cases, and he intentionally chose cases that involve like student freedoms, student liberties at school, whether like you can do a check of their backpack when there's suspicion of X, Y, or Z, because I agree that we have to teach the core, just a core sort of government or American democracy class and sort of all the core content that one would expect to be in that class. but I also agree that it has to be applicable to kids and their lives, or it's not going to stick. And so that teacher chose to do Supreme Court cases. Robert, who also teaches the civics class at our school, chose to do it through policy briefs and through, like forcing students to have to take a stand and present a policy brief on something that matters and is connected to their Change the World project. So I think there are really rich ways to teach civics well and to teach how our government works, and to make sure that we are giving that foundation while also making it extremely applicable to students and their lives. And then the last thing I'll say is just when you're dealing with students who are predominantly from historically underserved communities, students who are in high numbers financially poor, it is really difficult to keep it in just the abstract or the concrete without any application. If one of their parents is currently incarcerated, for example, or they have seen the impact of the war on drugs in their community and their siblings. And so I just think it has to come back to community, not to try to indoctrinate or engender activists that look just like the teachers that are teaching the course, but as a way to speak to the lived experiences of the kids in front of you. And that's going to look different if it's in rural Maine versus Camden, New Jersey, but it is the job of the teacher to teach those underpinnings and also talk about the lived experience of the kids in front of them, and do so in a way that is not biased and is not just indoctrination. And that is a hard tightrope to walk. And I think teachers, I tip my hat to them every day. I was a teacher for 9.5 years. Teachers have the hardest, but also the most rewarding, magical job in the world. And so we have to keep equipping them and giving great professional development. But I think at the policy level, you've got to just require it. If you're not requiring civics, if you're not creating graduation requirements, you can expect that that is going to drop off of all of the myriad things that a school has to get done for kids.
A question in the back.
Yeah, I'm one of the representatives or the state government officials you talked about hopefully being in the room, so I do appreciate you being here and your perspective. I've been excited about this subject ever since I was a geek, middle-aged kid watching Fireline on PBS and the McLaughlin Report and things of that nature, and even sponsored a high school politics club, neutral, try to give points, counterpoints, but brought different elected officials locally in to give the kids a perspective. So I'm glad that there's an outlet, but to the senator's concern, I agree with the senator that spoke. I do have a concern about the agenda-driven and the viewpoints that you all kind of maybe are portrayed on that. And you talk about fault lines, and I'm kind of curious, why do those fault lines exist? Did they not exist 50 years ago in education when we were teaching social studies and physics? And why do they exist? And then I guess my other point in that is, if they do exist, that's fine. They probably are always existed. Let's address and acknowledge that. And in the curriculum that we do provide and what you're trying to provide is give that point counterpoint for the one side, and then give the same point counterpoint for the other side. I think that should be what the kids should be learning. And then just as an aside, you can answer that here in a second, but then I just have a personal pet peeve, and even when I registered for this seminar conference, I even wrote this in my registration. Why do we call it a democracy? Other literature, every time you talked about our form of government, it's a republic. It's not a democracy, and it's a personal pet peeve of mine, maybe for a lot of other people's. I don't understand why that is perpetuated. So again, just a personal pet peeve. So anyways, thank you.
Scott, you want to talk about, does the work that you do involve a specific approach to civil discourse that can kind of bridge some of these divides that we're talking about?
Yeah, ideally, and I think, I appreciate those points. I will say, I don't want to necessarily tackle the democracy versus republic question right now, but I will say that we fundamentally believe that in a functioning democracy or republic or whatever you want to call it, there has to be divergent opinions. I think that that's just a fact, and that's something that I think is lost in a lot of our political discourse in this moment, but that's something that we teach in the classroom, that it is natural, that it is needed to have different folks espouse different opinions, and then it's about coming to some sort of consensus or some sort of decision. And so that's something that we actually teach in our classrooms, is that discourse. We model it very explicitly, and students have to choose one issue. You'll have some students that want to choose public transit, another that want to choose housing. They have to figure out a way to come to one issue. There's no way in the class for them to choose two issues. That's a very specific example. But we also do work in more conservative communities. I mean, we have folks, we have students in our classrooms and classes that have argued for more funding for charters, and students that have advocated for less. We have students that have advocated for increased community oversight of police boards, and we have students that have advocated for more police officers, period. And so both of those things happen in our classrooms, and I think that's healthy, and that's going to happen in democracy. So I hope it's not. I will say on the historical point, why is this different than it used to be? I think two fundamental answers to that, and I'm sure that this is insufficient. One is that civics has been historically marginalized for a long time. And so I think the reasons that the fault lines are emerging now is because I think that there is an understanding that there should be more civics now. So when there's an understanding that there should be more civics, there's going to be discussions that come, as with any subject, about what that should mean. And the second question is, our democracy looks a lot different now than it used to. And that's just going to mean that we have to address these issues in different ways. And I think that thinking that we can just teach them the way that we used to doesn't equate. And so I think that that's something that we just have to wrestle with as well. But I think we're a values-driven organization, but I wouldn't call us a leftist organization. I would just say that we want students to understand and learn how government works. And as Louise said, we think that an effective way to do that is through creating a civics lab. But absolutely, they should learn about the foundations and fundamentals and how many branches of government there are as well.
Okay, I just want to address directly this point. If you read our brochures, we use the word democratic republic quite a bit. Right, and I think that's a fair term. We also use American democracy, by which we mean it's a very different and unique form of government, the longest democracy in the world. But what I would invite is for people to actually come to the table trying to forge solutions across partisan lines. And a lot of times I hear that argument as a way to split people, right? And that's really what we are. The exact opposite. We try very hard to take no partisan approach and just try to forge a consensus on state policy that your community will buy. So that's just what I invite you to do.
We have time for one more question in the back.
I think this lady.
Oh, have you been waiting? I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. I'm Gail Bates. I'm a recovering politician, but I'm currently on the state school board. In my county, I'm from Maryland. My county, Howard County, is one of the more affluent, whatever. But for the last about 17 years, we have had a program in our 5th grade where our students study the history of our country. They study Maryland history, how it works with it. They learn about the Constitution. They use the book, We the People, the Citizen and the Constitution, that was developed at the Bicentennial. And at the end of the year, they provide their insight to people like me in a little performance assessment that we do. And I love it. I'm really proud of these students for being able to think and disagree and agree and all of that kind of, see the application. What frustrates me, I will tell you up front, first of all, my county's the only one doing it. It's countywide. Out of the whole state of Maryland. I think more people should be doing it. But number two, the quality varies from teacher to teacher. Some of the teachers absolutely have the students so programmed as if there's only one or two answers to each question. I find that really frustrating. When I can see students thinking and questioning, we ask open-ended questions. There's no right or wrong to any of them. And I'm more interested in their reasoning for why they do what they do or why they say what they say. But I find some classes are far more programmed to the point where last year, one group, we finished the prepared questions. I said, we have some extra time. The teacher, oh, no, we're finished. I said, no, we have extra time. I'm going to ask the students a question they're not prepared for. And they're like, I said, what's your favorite amendment to the Constitution and why? All of a sudden, the light bulbs went off. Every hand went up. We need to give these children a chance to to think and reason, because if not, they're going to be indoctrinated. So I hope that's part of this is not really a question, but I really hope that's part of the programs that you all are doing. Teach them how to evaluate it. It was really fun when we had some students got debating about whether a president should serve more than 2 terms, and they forgot we were there. I mean, that was learning. So anyway, I would encourage that kind of thing. I hope we could have this nationwide, because I think we're losing ground when we don't know why we are who we are.
Thank you, Gail. Why don't we have one more question in the back before we wrap up, and then some final
I'll be
comments.
relatively quick and probably don't need much of a response. Like my friend from Michigan, I very much feel like you're on the wrong tangent. I believe we have a problem when citizens are summoned to jury duty. They don't even understand what that's about. When we have a simple question, how many people are on a jury? How many people are on a grand jury? What does a grand jury do? Getting away from the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, I think has been a major problem in this country. And I mean, I think it's important to know, when the first slave ships arrived in the Western Hemisphere, but there's too much emphasis on the negative and too little emphasis on how our framers put together a unique form of government that has survived because it was thought out. It took the best of the individual, democracy, if you will, and then it took the best of the intelligentsia, the republic, if you will, the Roman Republic, the Greek system, and they studied it, and they came up with what we have, which is truly, truly a beautiful thing. One of the most moving experiences of my life was to sit in the room at Montpelier where Madison literally sat and did his studying of all the past governmental systems and how he came up with many of the ideas that are now part of the Constitution. So when we get talking about we're going to create activists and we're going to have social warriors out here in the streets and you need to go lobby, no, we don't need that. We're threatened with curricular time is so precious now anyway, to spend it not teaching our children about the basics of this is your government, you're a voter, you're going to serve on juries, you're going to vote for these different levels of government. You need to be educated on what this is all about. And I just think y'all wandered off course on this in much of what you're doing, and it deeply does concern me because I came to this session thinking, well, I want to get some answers to solve the problems that people are talking about of the total lack of just plain old knowledge of how our system works. But don't mean to jump on you. I appreciate the efforts you make, but I do have a lot of concerns on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to tie those last 2 comments that we heard together, I mean, we're talking about both decisions that need to be made around the content of civics education and also around professional development. Curious for some final thoughts on, particularly as it relates to state policy, how states should be thinking about content and what we might need to do in order to support teachers effectively to be good civics educators in the classroom.
So I would say, please go and see icivics.org, right? I think it is very clear that what we are doing is trying to teach students about how the system of government works. That's it. So if there's a misconception out there, that's what we're doing. It needs to have curricular time in the classroom. I just reject the idea that you can only do that. I think if you're talking to a student whose experience of our government has been negative, you need to overcome that by being able to relate the experience that he had with the government or she had with the government in a way that will make sense to them. It does not take away for how fantastic a country we have. I have talked about the importance of patriotism and of service to our nation, and that is the central core. That is what we're trying to do. So when state policymakers look at what they need to do, they need to hold these 2 ideas at the same time. And I think we're able to do that as a nation. And that's what I would ask you to do, to try to take a policy lens that favors knowledge and also favors the idea that you need to make this knowledge stick.
Natasha?
I would agree with all of that and just add to it that I think a great civics education has to be married with a great education on history. I think the big elephant in the room here is that like a lot of the radical left started doing work to be able to tell other layers of history in American history. When I was in 4th grade, there was probably 2 sentences about slavery in the US history textbook that I used. And if we want to get to the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise is the Constitution. That is an education in our Constitution and the foundations of our government. Do I think the radical left has gone too far with some of the efforts on college campuses, which basically mean that people with minority viewpoints can't speak? Absolutely. Do I think indoctrination is a problem, or creating activists that look just like you is a problem? Absolutely. But I think to say that we can have a conversation about an excellent civics education without also talking about the people in power who are writing history at any given time could leave out whole groups of people and whole strands of our history would be just a lie. And so I think history and getting it right and getting a really rich history in front of American students has to be married with a great civics education.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. To attempt to end on a more positive note too, I think that even not from you, but even the fact that we're having this conversation here at this conference is not something that would have been happening 5, 10, 15 years ago. Civics wasn't on the radar, and so I think the fact that it's on the radar is not a result of any specific election. It's not the result of any specific politics that our country sees today, but it's the result of the fact that we've consistently deprioritized the subject for decades in our schools is readily apparent from all sides of the aisle. So these are the kinds of conversations that have to happen. And if you disagree with us, that's good and healthy, and the types of conversations were happening because there wasn't even space to have these disagreements before. So I think that that's a good thing. I will say that to go back to the negative, that the most worrisome stat that I've seen is actually not the knowledge stats, and I think that those are important. But the most worrisome statistic is, and I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but it's only about 25% of young people, 18 to 30-year-olds, think that living in a democracy is important, that democracy is the best system of government. That is the most problematic statistic out there, because if young people don't believe that the system of governance that we live in actually can lead to better outcomes for them, can lead to better educational outcomes, economic outcomes, the system cannot hold. And so how we get to a better place there, if people believe that democracy is a better place, I believe, and we see this, that they're going to be more motivated to learn more about the Constitution, that they're going to be more motivated to learn about the realities of our history, the good and the bad. But we need to understand that young people are coming to this from a place of not thinking that democracy is the best system of governance for them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that we need to grapple with head on, but I appreciate the fact that this conference addressed this head on as well.
Now, I'll just conclude by saying the chiefs that are in my membership at Chiefs for Change lead in every political context imaginable, including Alaska, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana. And what's very encouraging to me is to see them beginning to prioritize this area of education and really elevate it within their conversations in state education agencies and in school districts. So I continue to believe there's a lot of essential common ground here, and I'm glad that you are all here to be part of this conversation today, and optimistic about this work moving forward. So thanks again for coming.